A woman, humiliated by her arrogant husband in front of high society guests, decides to walk out of the luxurious dinner, not in tears, but with silent determination. Everyone thought her life was over, but within months, she transforms her pain into power, building an empire so strong that the same man who mocked her ends up standing in its shadow. This is not a story of revenge, it's a story of rebirth. A journey from humiliation to dominance. From being laughed at to being looked up to. The crystal chandeliers above shimmered like trapped stars, throwing their reflections across the marble floor of the Grand Haven Hotel. Laughter echoed from every corner of the ballroom, soft, controlled, the kind that sounded expensive. I sat beside my husband, Adrian, at a table covered in gold-rimmed glasses and untouched luxury. Everything looked perfect, except the way my heart was breaking behind my polite smile. He had always loved attention. But tonight, he didn't just crave it, he demanded it. As the waiter poured champagne into the glasses, Adrian raised his voice just enough to let the crowd hear. "Marriage," he said with a smirk, "is a business deal, except mine came with too much emotion." The table burst into laughter. I felt every eye flick toward me, waiting to see if I'd laugh too. I didn't. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, my nails almost drawing lines into the crystal.
He didn't stop there.
"You see," he continued, his tone dripping with amusement, "my wife once told me she wanted to build something meaningful. And look at her now, she built a Pinterest board." The laughter roared louder this time. I smiled, but not for them, for myself. That was the moment I decided it was over. The evening dragged on like a slow humiliation. I sat still, staring at the glittering chandeliers above me, letting their light blur into silver streaks. In that blur, I saw the years I'd given him, the late nights helping him polish business pitches, the quiet support when he doubted himself, the sacrifices I made to make us look perfect. All of it reduced to a punchline. When the music began to play, couples stood to dance. Adrian offered his hand to another woman at the table. "Just for fun," he said, and twirled her toward the center of the room. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, straightened my dress, and walked out. No scene. No shouting. Just silence. Outside, the night air hit my skin like truth, cold, clean, and sharp. I left the hotel without looking back. My heels clicked against the marble steps as if marking every beat of my decision. That was the last night I was his wife. The next morning, the city felt different. The same skyline I had admired for years suddenly looked like a challenge. I rented a small workspace. Nothing glamorous, just a single room with peeling paint and a window that overlooked the alley behind a coffee shop. It smelled of old paper and potential. I didn't know exactly what I was building. I only knew what I would never be again: small. At first, I started with what I knew: design. The same designs Adrian once called a hobby. I posted one concept online, then another. The first few months were quiet, too quiet. But silence can be a blessing when it hides your rebirth. I worked 16-hour days, learning what I didn't know, perfecting what I did. Rejection emails became my alarm clock. But one day, a luxury interior firm stumbled across my work. They didn't just like it, they wanted to collaborate. That single collaboration turned into 10, then 20. And within a year, I was no longer renting that room. I owned an entire floor downtown. My company, Aurelia Studio, became a name whispered in elite circles. The same people who once laughed with my husband now booked appointments with me months in advance. And him? He tried to reach out, polite messages, fake congratulations, all dripping with nostalgia for something he'd buried himself. But what truly made me realize how far I'd come wasn't success. It was the dinner. A year to the date, I received an invitation to the same Grand Haven Hotel, a charity gala. I hesitated, then smiled. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was closure. I wore a gown of my own design, sleek, silver, and unapologetically elegant. When I entered the ballroom, the chandeliers sparkled the same way, but everything else had changed. This time people turned because they knew who I was. And then, across the room, I saw him. Adrian. He froze mid-conversation. The same smirk that once humiliated me now faltered. I walked up to him slowly, every step deliberate. Adrian, I said softly, it's been a while. He tried to smile, but his eyes betrayed him. You look successful. I tilted my head slightly. I am. He looked around, uncomfortable with the silence that followed. The man who once mocked me for wanting to build something meaningful now stood speechless in front of what I had built, a reputation, an empire, a new life. He reached for his glass, perhaps to find comfort in the act, and said, You've really changed. I smiled faintly. No, Adrian. I just became who I was before I met you. The orchestra began to play behind us, soft and distant. I turned away, letting the sound wash over me. As I walked toward the balcony, I realized I didn't need to prove anything. The revenge wasn't in my success, it was in my peace. Outside, the city lights glowed like promises kept. The air smelled like rain and renewal. For the first time in years, I felt weightless. Not because I had defeated him, but because I had finally found me. When I returned inside, I was greeted by one of the hosts who introduced me to a group of investors. They wanted a partner on a new design line. As they spoke, I caught a glimpse of Adrian at the bar, his reflection blurred in the mirror behind them, a man watching a life he'd thrown away. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel pride. Just peace. Because in the end, he gave me something I never would have found otherwise, the push to become unstoppable. He mocked my marriage that night, but unknowingly, he built my empire. Months turned into years, but I still remembered that night, not with pain, but with power. The echo of that laughter had once haunted me, but now it only reminded me of how far I'd climbed since. Aurelia Studio was no longer just mine. It had become a movement, a symbol of resilience for every woman who had been underestimated, every dream that had been laughed at. From Paris to New York, our name appeared in magazines, on award lists, in whispered conversations at the kind of dinners where I once felt invisible. People often ask me, what changed you? I never knew how to answer that question. Because change wasn't a moment, it was 1,000 tiny decisions to keep going when no one was watching. I had a team now, brilliant designers, architects, visionaries. But more than that, I had freedom. The kind of freedom money can't buy. The freedom to walk into any room without shrinking, to speak without trembling, to exist without apology. One afternoon, as I was reviewing sketches for our upcoming luxury project in Milan, my assistant walked in, holding an envelope. It's marked private, she said softly. I took it, expecting another business proposal. But the handwriting on the front froze me. Adrian. For a moment, my breath caught. Years of silence, and now this. I opened the letter slowly. His words were careful, almost fragile. He wrote that his company had failed, that he'd lost almost everything. He said he'd been following my journey, that he was proud of me, that he missed who he used to be. I read it twice, not out of nostalgia, but disbelief. The man who once measured my worth in jokes was now asking for a meeting. I didn't feel revenge. I felt nothing. Still, I agreed to meet, not for closure, but for confirmation. The cafe was quiet, elegant, the kind of place I used to dream about visiting when success was still just a word on my vision board. When I walked in, he was already there. The years had aged him differently. Not in the lines on his face, but in the heaviness behind his eyes. Thank you for coming, he said, standing awkwardly. I nodded, sitting across from him. You said it was important. He looked down at his hands, twisting his ring. The same ring I'd once worn a matching pair of. I made mistakes, he said. I thought success meant power. But I lost both. His voice trembled for the first time in his life. It should have felt satisfying hearing that. But it didn't. Because power that depends on someone else's weakness isn't power at all. He looked up, his voice small. Do you ever think we could have worked out differently? I smiled faintly. We did. Just not together. He nodded, silent. There was no argument, no drama, just a quiet acceptance that some stories end not because of hate, but because growth leaves no space for who we once were. As I left the cafe, The reflection on the glass door caught my eye, him sitting alone, watching the woman he'd once mocked now walking away with a kind of grace that no apology could buy. That was the real ending. But endings are strange things. Sometimes they give birth to new beginnings. 3 months later, I launched the Aurelia Foundation, a global mentorship program for women who had been silenced, broken, or dismissed. It wasn't about business anymore. It was about legacy. I wanted to create something that outlived the applause, something that reminded people that dignity isn't inherited. It's built. The first event took place in the same Grand Haven ballroom. The chandeliers still glittered above, but this time, their light reflected on faces filled with hope, not judgment. Women from different cities, different stories, all gathered under one roof, not to be seen but to be heard. As I stood on that stage, looking at them, I felt something shift inside me. I realized that my empire wasn't made of glass towers or marble floors. It was built from every scar, every sleepless night, every moment I chose myself when it would have been easier to give up. I began to speak, not from a script, but from the heart. There was a time, I said softly, when I thought dignity meant silence. That if I smiled through pain, people would respect me. But I learned that silence only feeds the people who want you small. The real dignity is in standing tall when the world wants you to bow. The crowd fell silent, not because they were sad, but because they understood. Later that night, as the event ended, I found myself standing alone near the same balcony where I once promised myself a new life. The city below sparkled again, but this time, it didn't look like a challenge. It looked like home. My phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. Just 3 words. I'm proud of you. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to reply. Because some stories don't need closure. They need peace. And I finally had mine. The empire I built wasn't born from revenge. It was born from resilience. And the man who once mocked me had unknowingly been the first brick in its foundation. As I looked out into the night, I realized that success had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving myself right. The laughter that once humiliated me had turned into applause. But the real victory wasn't in the sound. It was in the silence that followed, the kind that only comes when your heart finally whispers, "You made it." I closed my eyes, feeling the soft wind against my face. The girl who once walked out of that dinner was gone. In her place stood a woman who didn't just survive the fire, she learned to dance in it. Because sometimes, dignity isn't about walking away quietly. It's about walking back stronger, wearing your scars like diamonds. And as the lights of the city shimmered beneath me, I smiled. Not because I'd built an empire he envied, but because I'd built a life I loved.